The Kethrani Warfleet Admiral had exactly 4 seconds to understand what was about to kill her. She spent all 4 of them in denial. "That's impossible," Admiral Voss Kethrani whispered, staring at the tactical display as 91 warships. Vessels built from a design her own species had supposedly annihilated 3,000 years earlier, dropped out of slipspace around her flagship in perfect silent formation. "That species is extinct. We made sure of it. We were thorough." The lead vessel opened a channel, no demands, no threats. Just a single voice, calm and almost gentle, speaking a language the Kethrani translation corps flagged as ancient Terran, presumed deceased. "You were thorough," the voice agreed. "You just weren't complete." Then every shield across the Kethrani fleet failed at once, and Admiral Voss Kethrani understood, in her final seconds of command, that her people's oldest nightmare had just come home. But to understand how humanity's ashes had ever learned to breathe again, you had to go back 3,000 years, to the day Earth actually died. The Kethrani Dominion had been the galaxy's apex power for 11,000 years when they found humanity, a species barely out of its own atmosphere, squabbling, divided, and utterly unprepared for what watched them from the dark. The Kethrani doctrine was simple and had never once failed them. Any species capable of eventually rivaling their dominance was to be removed before that rivalry could mature, not conquered, not enslaved. Removed completely, so thoroughly that no record of the extermination would ever need explaining to anyone who might object. Humanity took 4 years to die. The Kethrani fleet was patient, methodical, devastatingly efficient. Earth's cities burned in careful sequence. Its orbital defenses, primitive by galactic standards, lasted 11 days. By the time it was finished, the Kethrani had scrubbed humanity from the historical record so completely that even their own children, 3,000 years later, believed the species had simply never mattered enough to remember clearly. What the Kethrani never found, what their thorough, patient extermination missed by less than 6 hours, was a single evacuation convoy of 40,000 souls, launched in desperation from a hidden research colony on the far side of Earth's moon. Running silent, running toward the one thing that might save them. A folded pocket of space so unstable that no Kethrani scout had ever bothered charting it, because nothing sane would hide there. Humanity did. For 3,000 years, in a nebula the Kethrani star charts simply labeled unstable a void. The descendants of that convoy rebuilt everything from nothing. They had no home planet, only generation ships grown into slow, sprawling arcs. They had no galactic history except the one story every child was raised to know by heart. We were erased and we survived anyway, and one day we will make sure it never happens to anyone else. That story became a civilization's entire purpose by the time the Kethrani Dominion encountered the 91 warships at what would later be called the Reckoning at Voss's Reach. Humanity's hidden descendants, calling themselves simply the Remnant, had spent 3 millennia doing something no other species in galactic history had ever attempted. Studying their exterminators in complete secrecy, learning every weakness the Kethrani doctrine had never bothered hiding from a species they believed extinct. The Remnant's leader, Fleet Speaker Amara Chen, 10th-generation descendant of the original evacuation convoy's chief engineer, had spent her entire life preparing for a single terrible decision: whether to reveal her people to a galaxy that had, 3,000 years ago, decided humanity deserved to die simply for existing. "We could stay hidden," argued Ren Okafor, her chief strategist, during the final council before the Reach. "Another century, another 1,000 years if we need it. We're safe where we are." "We're safe," Amara agreed, "but we're not free. And the Kethrani are still out there, Ren, still doing to other species exactly what they did to us. How many worlds have burned since Earth did, because we were too afraid to remind the galaxy we existed?" That question ended the debate. 3 days later, the Remnant fleet emerged from the nebula for the first time in 3,000 years. They did not attack unprovoked. That distinction mattered enormously to Amara, who had grown up hearing her ancestors' stories of a species extinguished without trial, without warning, without mercy. Humanity would not become the thing that had erased it. Instead, the Remnant fleet intercepted the Kethrani war fleet mid-exercise, at what the Kethrani had assumed was a routine show of force against a minor border species called the Ithfal, a small agrarian people whose only crime, like humanity's 3,000 years earlier, was showing early signs of technological potential the Kethrani doctrine flagged as an eventual threat. Admiral Voss Kethrani had been 3 hours from beginning the extermination when 91 remnant warships appeared and, without firing a single shot, simply placed themselves between the Kethrani fleet and the Ithval homeworld. That was the message. Not an attack, a wall. Stand down, Amara's voice said, broadcast to every ship in the Kethrani formation. This world does not die today, Admiral Voss laughed at first. A fleet of 91 ships, however advanced, standing against the full might of a Kethrani war fleet built to erase entire civilizations, seemed almost sentimental in its futility. She stopped laughing 4 seconds later, when every shield in her fleet failed simultaneously. Disabled by a targeted resonance cascade, the Kethrani's own sensors hadn't even detected being deployed. Technology the Remnant had spent 3,000 years perfecting specifically to counter the exact extermination doctrine that had killed their ancestors. No one died in that engagement. That, too, was deliberate. Amara had made the decision years earlier, over Ren's fierce objection, that humanity's return to the galaxy would not begin with a massacre, however satisfying vengeance might feel to 3,000 years of inherited grief. We disable, she'd ordered. We do not destroy. Let them survive to explain what they saw. And explain it, the surviving Kethrani did. First to their own horrified Dominion command, and within weeks through channels no Kethrani sensor could fully suppress, to the wider galaxy that had spent 3,000 years, believing the extermination doctrine was a quiet, victimless efficiency rather than the systematic murder of an entire civilization. The truth stunned every treaty world that heard it. Species after species began quietly re-examining their own ancient historical gaps. Worlds and civilizations that had simply vanished from galactic record, explained away by Kethrani administrators as natural extinction events that, in hindsight, followed an uncomfortably consistent pattern. Humanity's survival became the single hardest piece of evidence in a case that had been building, unnoticed in 100 forgotten archives for centuries. The Kethrani Dominion had not simply defended its dominance. It had spent 11,000 years quietly, methodically murdering every species that threatened to grow up. 9 months after the reckoning at Voss's reach, a coalition of 43 species, many of whom had lost their own ancient civilizations to unexplained extinction events, now retroactively understood, formally convened a galactic tribunal against the Kethrani Dominion. Fleet Speaker Amara Chen was invited to testify not as a petitioner, but as living proof of the crime itself. She stood before that tribunal in the same modest engineer's uniform her ancestor had worn on the night Earth burned, 3,000 years and one impossible survival earlier. You will hear testimony today, she told the assembled representatives, about doctrines and death tolls and diplomatic consequences. I only want to tell you one thing before that begins. She paused, letting the silence stretch. My ancestors had 4 hours to decide whether humanity would survive. They chose to run and hide and rebuild, rather than die with dignity in a war they couldn't win. For 3,000 years, every generation of my people carried the weight of wondering if that choice made us cowards. Her voice did not waver. I'm here today to tell you it didn't. It made us patient. And patience, it turns out, is the only thing that outlasts an empire built on making sure no one lives long enough to remember what it did. The tribunal's verdict took 11 months to finalize. The Kethrani Dominion, stripped of its extermination fleets, its territorial holdings reduced by 2/3, its entire military command structure dissolved and rebuilt under permanent multi-species oversight, became, within a decade, a cautionary footnote taught in every treaty world's history archives. The empire that grew so afraid of being surpassed that it forgot survival could not be legislated forever, only delayed. Humanity, meanwhile, did something no one expected from a species with every justification for endless vengeance. They didn't seize the Kethrani's former territory. They didn't demand tribute or trials for every Kethrani citizen, or the kind of reckoning 3,000 years of grief might have earned them. They simply asked for one thing, a seat at the table, so the next species facing extermination would have someone in the room who remembered exactly what that felt like. Standing in the ruins of what had once been Kethrani High Command, watching the remnant flag, a simple starfield pattern representing every convoy ship that had carried humanity's survival, rise for the first time over territory that had once belonged to their exterminators. Amara Chen said the words her ancestors had waited 3,000 years to hear spoken by a free human, on a world humanity had chosen, rather than fled to. We were supposed to be a lesson in what happens to species that get erased, she said quietly, to no one and everyone. Instead, we became the lesson in what happens to empires that assume erasure is permanent.